Have you ever wondered what happens behind the doors of a morgue? As we say in our dialect, the furnace, a place where strange things happen, and many times there are events that have no scientific or logical explanation. This world is full of mysteries and secrets. It is here that the forensic doctor plays a very different role from his usual one, almost like a detective. Their job is to determine the cause of death for many people. The forensic doctors must have a very strong character. When I say strong, I mean they must be exceptionally tough, and it's essential that they have a hard heart. Whether they are born with this nature or acquire it over time through their work, one thing is clear: their character becomes very tough after the experiences they go through. It is impossible to ask a forensic doctor about a case that has stayed in their mind. There will always be one case that sticks with them, one they can never forget. For those of you wondering what really goes on in that room when the forensic doctor is working, honestly, there are things that happen there with no logical explanation. There are some very strange occurrences that even the doctors who work in this field have become accustomed to. They're used to the unusual sounds, the unsettling experiences, and yet they continue their work without reacting because it's become part of the job. They've learned to ignore the oddities because it's normal for them now. I remember reading a book by a retired forensic doctor who shared his career journey and some of the terrifying cases he encountered. These were cases that didn't make sense at all. Situations so strange that they would leave anyone terrified. But as I mentioned, after years of working in this field, these doctors just pushed through and continued doing their jobs without letting it affect them too much. They've become so accustomed to it all that nothing fazes them. Now, let me get into the story. This isn't just any ordinary story. It's a dangerous and thrilling one, full of suspense, mystery, and fear. I'm sure you'll enjoy it because it's packed with excitement and shocking twists. So, settle down in a comfortable place, no kids around, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and let's dive in. First of all, I want to thank you all for your support and encouragement through likes and nice comments. I truly appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Now, let's get to the real story. My name is Rashid, and since I was young, I had a clear dream. I wanted to become a doctor. I was born into a wealthy family, one where everyone, your cousins, uncles, aunts, was either an engineer, a member of parliament, a pilot, a teacher, or a journalist. From the outside, it looked like a very successful family. But as with any successful family, there were also conflicts and jealousy among us, as you might expect. But let me focus on my own story. I didn't have a childhood like other kids. I grew up with my parents always planning for my future, and they made it clear that I was going to study medicine and become a doctor. This was their dream for me, not mine. They pushed me to follow this path because I was the eldest son, and they wanted me to make them proud in front of the family. I didn't have a choice in the matter. They made sure I studied hard, and I didn't really know much about life outside of school. I didn't know how to play or have fun like a typical child. But even though I didn't live the childhood I wanted, I understood that my parents only wanted the best for me. As I grew up, I realized they just wanted me to be successful. When I became a parent myself, I saw that they were doing the best they could. Maybe their method wasn't perfect, but it led me to where I am today. When I graduated high school at 18, unlike many of my classmates, I I already knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I was going to study medicine and become a doctor. There was no question about it. My mind was set, and I didn't have the option to choose anything else. It was always going to be medicine. I was prepared for the next 9 years of studying in France to become a doctor. But what I didn't expect was that at the end of those 9 years, I would have to make a new decision. What specialty would I choose in medicine? At that point, I was an adult, and I could finally make my own choices. But even then, my family had very clear ideas about what I should specialize in. They pushed me towards neurology because no one in the family had done that before. However, I wasn't interested in that path. I didn't want to make the same mistake I had made in the past by following their choice for me. So, I made a decision. I chose forensic medicine. This was a huge shock to my family. They didn't understand why I would choose a specialty with no money in it, one that could damage my mental health, and one that meant I wouldn't be able to open my own clinic. But I didn't care. I had made my decision, and I was determined to follow it. After almost 4 years of training, I finally became a forensic doctor at the age of 33. Forensic medicine was in high demand in France at that time, especially for men. It's a job that requires toughness, and for that reason, many men work in this field. I worked in France for a year, but then I decided to return to my home country because I wanted to serve my own people. Even though I was crushing my parents' hopes, I didn't care. I wanted to work for the state in my country. When I returned, I faced a cultural shock. I had spent 15 years in France, and the health sector there was far superior to what I found back home. There were only a few forensic doctors in my country at the time, and the work was tough. I worked in a hospital in a large city, far from where I grew up. The hospital was nothing compared to the ones in France, but I was okay with it. I was proud to be serving my country, even though the work was challenging. The work was tough, but I loved what I did. After almost a year, I had made many connections with people, including police officers, who were an important part of my job. One day, I was transferred to another city, and I became the only forensic doctor working in the hospital. I saw many cases come through my door, people who had died from various causes, asphyxiation, poisoning, or even drug overdoses. But there was one case that I will never forget in my life. For a whole year, me and the police were trying to figure out the cause of the death. I want to tell you guys that now. I'm starting to share with you the full story, starting from the incident to everything that followed. One evening, I was sitting at home. I had just eaten and rested a little. Then, my phone rang. It was my friend, who works as a police officer. I answered, and he said, "Hey Hisham, is everything good?" I could tell from his voice that something was off. He told me, "Listen, come to a specific location right away. Don't be late." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my car and drove to the location, which was about 20 minutes from where I live. When I arrived at the location, it was a large forest area. It's a place I'm familiar with, where people go for walks or to relax on weekends. But this time, it was different. This was the first time I was coming here after sunset. As I drove into the forest, I could see a lot of police cars. I followed the tire tracks of the vehicles. They were already doing their job, so I quickly got my gear, put on my mask, and prepared to work. When I entered the crime scene, I was in shock. It was the first time in my life that I saw something so disturbing and strange that it left me shaken. I found the body of a young man, probably in his 20s, tied to a tree. His eyes were wide open in a way that suggested fear, like he had seen something terrifying before he died. It was so unsettling to see his eyes like that, almost as if he was looking at something that scared him deeply. In the dark of the forest, it was an image that was truly terrifying. I knelt down, observing the scene. My team was busy taking fingerprints, photos, and collecting any evidence. I got closer to the body to examine it more closely. I untied the rope from around the young man's neck, and as soon as I did, he collapsed. I started checking his body to see if there were any marks or signs of violence. I was surprised. There were no marks on him at all, no bruises, no cuts, not even signs of any kind of struggle. His clothes were normal, not ripped or dirty. His clothes were clean, and it was like he hadn't even been in the forest for long. In fact, his clothes were so clean that it seemed like he hadn't been lying on the ground at all. The police also couldn't find any useful evidence, no fingerprints, no belongings, nothing. The body was taken away in an ambulance and brought to the morgue. I put on my work gear and went directly to the morgue. My colleagues and I placed the body in the fridge, and I continued to think about this young man. Physically, he seemed fine, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. We ran tests on him, but the results showed that he had died of natural causes. There was no poison, no drugs, nothing. His death appeared to be just a normal one, but there was something about this case that didn't sit right with me. A young man, clean and in good condition, dying in the middle of the forest, tied to a tree. It didn't make sense. I even considered the possibility that he was strangled or suffocated, but there were no marks on his neck. After weeks of investigation and many tests, all the results confirmed that his death was natural. There was nothing unusual about it from a medical standpoint. But for me and my police friend, Hisham, it still didn't make sense. How could a young man in his 20s who didn't take drugs, who didn't drink, just die in such a strange way? It was especially odd that he had been found in the forest, his eyes wide open, as if something had terrified him before he died. Even though everything seemed to point to natural causes, we knew there was more to the story. Unfortunately, the case was closed, and no one seemed to inquire further. We never found his identity, and nothing new came up in the investigation. After a week, the authorities gave the order to bury him. A week later, as I was sitting at home, not working, enjoying a cup of coffee, I suddenly felt a terrible pain in my head, a pain like I had never experienced before. It was so intense that I had to clutch my head. In that moment, I heard a ringing in my ears, and then I heard a voice whispering in my ear, "Don't leave me, please help." I was so confused. I kept telling myself, this can't be real. It must be my imagination. But then I heard the voice again, this time clearer, saying, "Don't leave me, please help." I felt a chill run through my body, and I rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and drank it. But still, the voice kept whispering in my ear. I had no idea what was happening. I dropped the cup from my hand, it shattered, and I started reading the Quran in fear. I won't lie to you, at that moment, I felt like my whole world was spinning. Out of fear, I turned on the TV and started listening to the Quran. Then I felt a bit relieved and I managed to fall asleep. That night, while I was asleep, I saw that young man again. His movements were the same as before, and I could see that same terrified look in his eyes. In the dream, he came closer and said to me, "Help me, I'm a victim of trust. Please, help me." I was sweating, terrified, and shaking. As the sun started rising, I couldn't sleep anymore. I got up, grabbed my car, and went straight to the same forest where I found the young man's body. I kept walking around until I reached the tree where he had been tied up. I was looking around, hoping to find something, but there was nothing, just silence. I thought to myself, how could I possibly help this young man? I didn't even know where to start. Plus, it had been a week since his burial, so there wasn't much time left. I felt hopeless, but then, as I was about to leave, I noticed something under the dirt. At first, I thought it was just some garbage, but when I got closer, I realized it was a photograph. I picked it up, and to my surprise, it was a picture of a woman and a small child. The child looked like it could have been his son. I couldn't explain why, but I felt deep down that the boy in the photo might be the victim, even though there wasn't a strong resemblance. I returned to my car and drove straight to the hospital. On the way, I called Hisham to tell him to meet me there. At the hospital, I changed into my uniform and walked straight to the morgue. I took the picture I found in the forest with me. I kept comparing the photo to the young man's body in the morgue, looking for any resemblance. Suddenly, I felt something strange, as though the body was moving. I couldn't explain it. But when I checked, I found nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. I put the body back in its place and returned to my office. I sat down and placed the photo of the woman and child on my desk, comparing it with the young man's photo from the crime scene. I was trying to find a connection, but just then I heard someone knock on my door. It was Hisham. He entered without greeting me and asked what I had found. I showed him the photo and asked if he had found any fingerprints on the boy. He replied, "No." I told him that means he has no identity. He must have been alive, but according to the justice system, he didn't exist. Hisham seemed to understand, but he asked, what could cause a child at such a young age to not have a civil record? There are two possibilities. Either the child deliberately erased his identity, maybe to hide from the law, or he was the victim of an illegal relationship and his parents didn't register him. Hisham was silent, thinking. He then told me he would keep the photo and left without saying goodbye. I returned to my work, but all I could think about was that young man. The next few days, I kept dreaming about him. Every night, I saw the same vision, and he kept speaking to me, saying, "Help me. I'm a victim." It was affecting my mental state, and I became paranoid. I'd never felt this way before. My work was becoming harder because of it. One day, while I was at work, I received a call from Hisham. He told me to come to his office right away. I went, and he showed me the photo again. He asked if I recognized the people in it, and I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "This is the woman who was in the photo with the child." I was shocked when I realized she was the same woman from the picture. We went to her house in a poor neighborhood. When we knocked on the door, an older woman answered. When I saw her, I knew it was the same woman from the photo, though she had aged. She looked at us with surprise and asked, "Who are you?" Hisham told her we were from the police and showed her the photo. As soon as she saw it, she began to cry and put her hands over the child's face in the picture. Hisham asked, "Do you recognize this boy?" She nodded and said, "Yes, that's my son." This was the last photo I took with him before he disappeared. Hisham asked her, "Is your son registered in the civil registry?" The woman, crying, nodded and said, "Yes, I did register him." I searched everywhere for him after he disappeared, but I couldn't find him. Hisham asked her for a blood sample, which we sent to the lab. We were waiting for the results, but every night I kept having the same dream about that young man, and it was driving me mad. A few days later, I had an encounter in a shop where two women were talking about the mysterious people and the supernatural. I didn't pay much attention at first, but later the topic lingered in my mind. It was as if everything was pointing towards something bigger. Something about the young man's case didn't add up. I called Hisham and asked him, "Do you think the boy could have been part of something supernatural?" Hisham laughed and asked, "Are you really asking me that? You're a professional and you're asking about superstitions?" But I felt certain that there was more to the story. I just needed to find the missing piece to solve the mystery. The death of this young man, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. It was a natural death. But still, questions kept coming up. Why were people looking for reasons? Why was the investigation continuing even though it had stalled? Hisham, who was investigating, paused, collected his thoughts, and then looked at me. He told me that every night when he went to sleep, he had a recurring dream where this young man would come to him asking for help. At first, I didn't believe it, but Hisham seemed sincere. He said, "I'm telling you the truth. When this boy told me, I was shocked." I told him, "You're an investigator. You write down the evidence. Why don't you follow up on this lead?" Hisham seemed a bit upset, but then agreed to continue the investigation. We discussed everything, and I mentioned how I had also seen similar dreams, even things that Hisham hadn't experienced. I explained to him that the spirit of this young man shouldn't be allowed to just pass away without knowing what really happened. We had to uncover the truth. Hisham, still skeptical, agreed to look further into the situation. We continued searching, trying to understand the significance of the signs in his dreams. I went to the hospital to follow up on some reports. I was drawn toward the morgue, and when I entered the hallway leading to it, the atmosphere felt strange. I eventually reached the freezer where the young man's body was kept, and when I touched it, I felt an intense cold. Suddenly, the lights in the morgue flickered, and I could feel the temperature drop. I opened the door, hoping to find someone who might explain what was happening, but no one was there. The light went out, and I had the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. At that moment, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I froze in place. My heart raced, and I could barely move. After gathering all my courage, I decided to move forward. The sensation was intense, but I managed to open the door and leave the room. When I got back to my office, I tried to charge my phone, which had been off. However, to my surprise, it was fully charged, and it felt as though something strange had happened. I couldn't understand it. Was it a hallucination? Was I losing my mind? I kept trying to figure it out. I decided to return to the morgue and check if the young man's hand had any marks, signs that he might have been involved in something unusual. Upon closer inspection, I saw a strange mark on his hand, confirming the suspicions I had. I immediately called Hisham and shared the discovery with him. He arranged a meeting to visit the possible mother of the young man. The day ended with me feeling exhausted and stressed from everything I had been through. I barely slept and continued my work as usual the next day. Hisham picked me up in the car, and we went straight to the house of that woman, the Haja, elderly woman. She welcomed us into her home and started telling us about her son. From her conversation, we learned that her son's name was Mohammed and that he was born as a result of an illicit relationship. Although the Haja didn't go into details, at one point she mentioned that Mohammed wasn't like other children. Everyone used to say that he was sorry, unlucky, or cursed, but she didn't pay any attention to these rumors. It wasn't a big deal for her until the day Mohammed went out to play near the door of the house, and then he just disappeared without a trace. She hadn't seen him again after that. Honestly, it wasn't something that was very important to the investigation at that moment, but Hisham still asked her if there was anyone else from her family. The Haja told us that she had a younger brother, but she hadn't seen him in a long time. She said he had gone abroad after getting involved in some issues. She hadn't heard from him in years. After leaving her house, Hisham informed his team so they could look into the brother's whereabouts, whose name was Taki. I returned to my work, but I won't lie, I started hearing things that were hard to explain. Whenever I was at the morgue, I began hearing strange sounds, things that didn't seem normal. But I kept telling myself to ignore it, to pretend I didn't hear anything. But truthfully, it scared me a lot. There were moments when I questioned myself, was I really hearing these things? Was it real, or was I imagining it? I started seeing shadows moving around when I was working at night. It felt like something was passing by, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. As for the results of the tests, they finally came back, and they were consistent. This meant that Mohammed was indeed the Haja's son. It was difficult for us to inform her that we had found her son after all these years, and the worst part was that we found him dead. Hisham wrote a report saying that we had found the victim's mother and that the case should be reopened. The burial was postponed until further investigation, and we decided not to inform the Haja until we had solved the mystery behind the case. Hisham wasn't at ease and kept following all the leads in the case to understand what happened that day. Meanwhile, Taki, the Haja's brother, was becoming an important lead. Hisham was getting closer to finding him. As for me, I couldn't stay calm anymore. I wasn't doing anything productive, especially with the dreams I started having every night. Whenever I'd rest my head to sleep, I'd see Mohammed. He would appear to me, asking for help, saying, "Don't leave me, you're close to finding the truth." Despite the disturbing dreams, I kept doing my best to assist in unraveling the mystery. After Hisham got more information on Taki, he called me and said that he had something important to share. I met with him and he told me everything about Taki. However, I won't tell you everything now, but you'll learn it later. Hisham and I made a plan after studying all the details. We decided that I would take on a new role, not as a doctor, but as someone playing the part of an investigator, or rather a treasure hunter. It might sound strange, but I was pretending to be someone looking for a treasure that my family had left behind. I went to a specific area and started asking around. I met a man who specialized in treasure hunting. He was a sorcerer who had been working in the occult, but had later shifted to treasure seeking. I changed my identity and told him a story about how my parents had passed away and left me a big treasure hidden on land that was in my name. I explained that it was forbidden for my parents to uncover the treasure, but now it was my turn to do so. The sorcerer believed me and agreed to help. He said he would bring some workers with him to study the land and see if the treasure was really there. We set off together, and during the trip, I could tell that the sorcerer, who went by the name Ramuni, was knowledgeable about the work. The plan was set, and I was ready to see how everything unfolded. But things weren't as they seemed. While I was with Ramuni, he introduced me to someone who would become very familiar to me, the Hodge's brother, Taki. I was shocked when I realized who he was. I didn't show it, though, and I pretended to be relaxed. Ramuni and Taki seemed eager, discussing the treasure and how much money it would bring. Later, I called Hisham to update him on the situation. He arrived, and the plan was still on track. I had Taki believe that everything was fine, that he would get his share once the treasure was found. The moment I stepped out of the car with Taki, I noticed a man in the back seat, 100% sure he was a police officer. Hisham was playing along, talking about honoring Taki and reassuring him that everything would go well. We continued driving, but I could feel something wasn't quite right. Eventually, Hisham stopped the car, and the moment I stepped out, it was clear the truth was close to being uncovered. We were about to learn a lot more than we had anticipated. Taki got up and went to speak with his brother, and then told us, "Let's go, both of you, push the car, let's go. You two push, and I'll go inside and drive the car," he added. "You push while I drive, it'll help with this little task." His brother, Hisham, smiled and said, No, that's too much, I'll do it." Taki replied, "No, we must help each other." "Fine." So he got down and started helping. I also got down, and our little brother, who was a police officer, helped us. I was on one side, and our little brother was on the other. They both pushed from the middle. At one point, Hisham told me, Look, Hisham, come help, you know how to do this." I agreed and took over. They continued pushing, while I pretended to be the one handling the car. They all helped with the push from the middle. At one point, they turned and faced Taki. He didn't understand what was happening. They seized him, and both of them turned towards him, giving him a surprise. He was confused and asked them, "What's happening? What do you want?" But they didn't respond to him. After that, they went back, sat in the back of the car, and he remained in a state of shock, not understanding anything. Hisham told me, "Go to the police station." Then, Taki realized what was happening. Everything was becoming clear. They took him directly to the station. I followed them during the investigation. I won't go into the details of the investigation, but everything went smoothly. Taki admitted everything, and the whole gang was arrested, including the leader, who was Ramuni. Now, let me tell you about Taki and how it all started. Mohammed was just a little kid when he opened his eyes to the reality that his mother had made a mistake with someone. He grew up with his mother and his brother Taki after their parents died. His mother, while pregnant with Mohammed, couldn't accept this situation. Taki didn't like the situation. He wanted to escape it, but he ended up staying with his family, and neighbors tried to reconcile things. Taki eventually accepted the situation, and Mohammed was born. Taki took good care of him as he grew up in their house. At the same time, Taki met a man, Ramuni, who introduced him to magic. Taki tried it once, and although it didn't work, he tried again and succeeded. They started doing things together, like using magic in ways that weren't good. They even started burying magic in the cemeteries. They moved to a distant village to avoid being seen, and Taki disappeared from his sister's sight. She thought he had gone to Europe, and she believed it. When Mohammed turned 6, he went out to play one day and didn't return. His mother went to the police, but there were no records or any sign of him. In fact, it was Taki who took Mohammed. He knew that Mohammed was special. He had the Zori traits, and not just any Zori, but one that had all the signs, which made him in high demand. However, Taki and Ramuni knew that Mohammed couldn't be useful to them yet because he was too young. So, Taki raised Mohammed, telling him that he was his father and that his real mother had died. He convinced him that Ramuni was his uncle. Mohammed, though young, had a special gift. Everything he touched would break. He had an energy that Taki and Ramuni used for their own gain. When Mohammed turned 18, Taki and Ramuni planned to start their rituals. But the treasure guards insisted that Mohammed had to be 20 before they could proceed. Taki and Ramuni waited, and when Mohammed turned 20, they took him to the forest to perform their dark ritual. Mohammed sat near a tree while Ramuni began chanting strange words. Taki drew a hexagram on the ground. Suddenly, Mohammed saw something shocking, and he couldn't look away. He was terrified, his eyes wide open, unable to understand what he was witnessing. The spirits, or demons, began to panic, realizing that the ritual was not going as expected. They tried to continue, but couldn't. In the end, they fled, realizing that something was wrong. They didn't know if the ritual had worked, but when they went to the treasure site, they confirmed that Mohammed had indeed been their sacrifice. Back at home, Mohammed's mother learned the truth. Her brother was responsible for everything that had happened. She was devastated. And I, too, had to deal with the terrifying dreams and nightmares from that day. This story is true, and I want to share it with you all, so you can understand the things we've been through. Thank you for following this story. It's a hard one, and I hope you learned something from it.